Hello and welcome to day 5 of History and Systems of Psychology. We're already into week 3, so I hope it's going well for everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with class, and what I'd like to do is talk briefly about assignment 1. Do you recall what the guidelines were for assignment 1?
Okay, there's a bit of a mix-up. Were we supposed to write down like 3 things from the video?
So that's not the first assignment. So I'm going back to the very first assignment where you were to choose someone from chapter 1 to write about. Okay, it's been a while, right? So choose someone from chapter 1 to write about, and then spend time talking about your career and what the philosopher's thoughts were, theories might in turn, help you in your future career. I have not recorded grades yet, but I have graded them and put grades in my own notebook. I want to give you the option of redoing that assignment for several different reasons, so don't freak out, but what I was envisioning, and I don't know if I was articulating this clearly, is that about half of your 8 to 12 sentences would focus on the philosopher at hand, and the other half would focus on your career. So I had some people that focused on 2 philosophers and didn't mention anything about a career. I had others who said, I'll use this in my future career, but didn't say what their career was or specifically how they would use the information. And then I had others of you who did everything. So just make sure you're really clear on the assignment guidelines. You were graded for each section of that. It was an application assignment, so that goes beyond summarizing, giving your takeaways on a philosopher, but rather taking that information and then thoughtfully reflecting on it, okay? So I will be hosting those grades after class. Like I said, if you'd like a redo, you can submit that to me via email by Sunday. All right? Okay. Assignment 2 is the one that you just submitted, correct? All right. What did that assignment cover?
The 1,000 Inventions article.
Okay. The House of Wisdom article, right. And what was the House of Wisdom? Do you remember the location of the House of Wisdom?
Iraq.
Very good, very good. Other things you remember? I'd ask you to discuss 3 points that were interesting to you from that article. What are some points you talked about?
They welcome pretty much male, female, all faiths. We're welcome.
Right. At the time, that was not happening, I'm sorry, back in the Greek times, that was definitely not happening in the academy or the lyceum. So it was really interesting to see that, right? To see that females were welcomed. That was not the case in many places of higher learning. Good. Something else?
Because of them having such diverse backgrounds, all languages were taught, and which also led to translators being sought after and being well paid.
Very well paid, right? So many different languages were spoken there. Great works like the works of Aristotle were translated into these different languages, and people were paid quite well for this. They received, I think, the equivalent of gold, so however heavy the book was, that's how much gold they received. That's a pretty good incentive, right? As a translator. What else?
From the House of Wisdom, another house named the House of Knowledge was able to come about as well.
Right, so it was the time of a lot of intellectual excitement and growth within the community. And we have the House of Wisdom, but from there developed smaller places for scholars to go in different parts of the empire to study. I thought it was a pretty interesting article, and again, when we talk about philosophy, we don't talk much about the House of Wisdom. We talk about the Academy, the Lyceum. And it's important to not only focus on Western philosophy, but also the impact of Eastern philosophy. Any other takeaways?
All right.
You also wanted to know a question we had. Mine was, what are caliphs?
So those are caliphs?
And those are leaders. Yeah, they don't ever define that term, do they? So that term, CALIPHS, means leaders. Excellent. All right, we're going to touch on chapter 1 for just a moment before we move into chapter 2. Any questions over the assignment, or am I good to move on? I'll take it as a yes. All right. All right. We've been covering Plato and Aristotle and Socrates pretty heavily until last Thursday, and then at that point we moved on and looked at Democritus. And actually, Democritus is mentioned later in chapter 1, but he comes before those people, so I want you just to keep that in mind. He was a slightly younger contemporary of Socrates, so after Socrates, but before Plato and Aristotle. He came up with the atomic theory. The Greek word atomia means uncuttable, and his belief that there was a limit to the divisibility of objects, that at some point you seek to be able to break objects down anymore. And this was a point that was revolutionary at the time, and it was met with a lot of skepticism. It wasn't until much later that people uncovered this work and started looking and saying, hey, the concept of the atom, that makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the legacies of Democritus. One of the reasons people were apprehensive about this idea was that it contradicted Greek assumptions about the nature of causality. Greeks, for the most part, assumed that if something occurred, it was because it was meant to be, right? And the idea of randomness made them very nervous. Takeaways from chapter 2, Plato and Aristotle regarded the human psyche as a reservoir of innate ideas and forms. Aristotle emphasized empirical experience as the necessary raw materials, and together they laid the groundwork for a future science of psychology. Last week I asked you to share some muddy points, and someone had a question about empiricism. Empiricism is simply using the empirical method, so learning about the world through our senses. Wanted to make sure that that was clear. All right. The fall of the Western Roman Empire around the 5th century led to the Dark Ages, and a lot of the information that was available, writings of Democritus would go into this category, as well as other Greek philosophers were condemned as pagan blasphemy by early Christian scholars. A lot of the works were lost in fires that were set, okay? So a lot of the work from the philosophers and people of that era was lost. That was about 1,000 years, and during that time, the Islamic Empire was developing a philosophy that, although it was influenced by Western philosophy, it also had its own, they had their own take on things. So we would say that it was influenced by the socio-cultural and political context. Islamic Empire rose rapidly a century after Prophet Muhammad's death, And many great multifaceted scholars were produced during this time. And this was in an array of disciplines. So while you might be an expert in mathematics, you may also know a whole lot about rhetoric. And it was encouraged that people seek diverse interests there. The works of Aristotle were a particular focus. As you guys were talking about translators earlier, the works of Aristotle were translated, and there was a very strong connection in the Islamic empire to this idea of empiricism. They thought the empirical method, it made a lot of sense to them, so that was something that they focused on a lot. Several people emulated Aristotle, becoming polymaths, experts in a wide variety of disciplines. We are moving now into Al-Kindi and Indo. What numerals? Arabic. You got it? All right. Tell me a little bit about these numerals. Why would you create a new number system?
Because it was simpler, made more sense, it was easier to write.
Right. Roman numerals were used, but that was a pretty laborious process and took a little bit of math just to figure out like what decade and year you were in.
These numerals were unique in several different ways. So first of all, we have a 0, right?
And secondly, we have a decimal. So we have a place for decimals. It makes it really easy to see powers of 10. It's much easier to express those. Okay, moving on to Avicenna. He was born in an area that's part of Uzbekistan. He was a young and not so humble prodigy who quickly surpassed his teachers and began his studies independently, and early on became interested in medicine. This was a bold statement. Avicenna said, "Medicine's easier to master than math and philosophy, so I'm going to seek to master that." At age 18, he cured a local sultan of a mysterious illness. And what happened as a result of that? Yeah, he had access to his library, which was very extensive. And you have to understand, this is at a time where books were not readily available. And when they were available to select few people, right? So the hoi polloi, otherwise known as masses, that word that you learned, were not granted access to these textbooks. He memorized Aristotle's major metaphysical writings and began a long and prolific career analyzing and writing about themes and theories of Aristotle. He published a lot of books, kind of an understatement. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, and in that he talks about Hippocrates, right? So he was a doctor, Hippocrates was a doctor, and he breaks down the humoral theory. He also talks a lot, there's that word empirical observations. He talks about the importance of observing someone, observing different disease states, and then he describes the most effective ways of treating those disease states. He didn't, however, feel like there are like X number of diseases and X number of ways to treat them, right? Instead, what did he think? They're not fixed? Okay. What do we mean by fixed? Okay. So even though he may talk about whatever is most beneficial to cure an ailment at this time, it doesn't mean down the line that something's not going to be revealed to treat this illness better, right? We can think of different medicines, and I don't know a lot about the history of medicine, but if we think about something even in psychology, psychiatry, antidepressants, and the major breakthroughs that have been made. So even though antidepressants have been around for a long time, there have been more people who have come up with better antidepressants, right? So figuring out how can we treat depression with the fewest side effects. And early medications often had side effects such as lethargy, etc. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and move into our PowerPoint for today. All right, we have a lot to discuss in this chapter. We're going to start today by talking about Descartes. René Descartes, he did so many different things in a lot of different areas of thought. And we're going to unpack many of the areas that he focused on today. We're going to also spend some time talking about the mind-body distinction. Let's think back to Hippocrates. What did he have to say about the mind and body? Maybe someone over here I've not yet heard from. What did he have to say about the connection between the mind and body?
Didn't they have to be like balanced or something?
Yeah, they need to be balanced. That's where that humoral theory comes into play. We're going to have a balance of those different humors in the body. Also a balance between mind and body in terms of understanding that it's important to not only nourish the mind by reading these great works, but also nourish the body and take care of your body, right? When Descartes comes around, he starts distinguishing mind from body. And although he does view an interrelatedness on some level, he talks about it in a little bit of a less holistic way. All right, so here we have Descartes in middle age. He was a French philosopher and mathematician. One of the takeaways, an item that you need to remember, is he promoted an idea called interactive dualism. And this was an interactive dualism between a material body and a material mind or soul. He considered those two different things that could work together with one another. All right, as we talk about the philosophers, it's always interesting to me to learn a little bit about their early life and maybe some influences that might have led them to studying what they did, right? Pursuing certain ideas. Well, Descartes was the son of a very successful lawyer. Like many other people we discuss, he was very precocious, and when he was 10 years old, he was sent to La Flèche, the best and most progressive school in France. So this was a school that was cutting edge, and he was like a giant sponge there. At the school, there was a heavy emphasis on theology and philosophy, although other subjects such as mathematics were taught. And that's a through line. The idea of an emphasis on theology is going to continue for some time. He quickly became a top pupil at his school. And if you look in the book on page, let's see, I think it's page 61. I want to read this because I think it's interesting to think of Descartes as a child. So we're on page 61, and we're in the second paragraph of René Descartes in the mind-body distinction. Descartes absorbed all this while becoming the top student at his school. According to legend, he convinced his teachers that he did his best thinking while meditating in bed. He got to meditate in bed while other students were doing chores. All right? You can only imagine what other students thought of that. It says this story may be mythical, but in later life, Descartes actually did a good deal of his serious thinking while in bed, jotting down notes on paper kept on his bedside table. And one of his most ingenious discoveries came when he was in bed. So it's a little bit of a theme throughout his life. As I said, he quickly became a top pupil at his school. This is La Flèche. Wanted to show you a picture of that. Pretty architecture, right? Yeah. That was my attempted sense of humor. Legend, wait for it, dairy. He was legendary, all right? He graduated at school from 16, and he was a little bit prone to, well, he was prone to skepticism, and that's part of his legacy, but he was also a little prone to depression, kind of on the moody side. And what he said is by age 16, he had learned absolutely everything he could learn from all the existing books available at that time. All right? And he was frustrated. He thought, is that all there is? Okay? There should be more. But he doesn't get started on this right away. He flounders a little bit. His dad was a successful lawyer and made a lot of money. So Descartes was fairly independently wealthy and unsupervised. Spent some time running around, doing things, experiencing life, which ultimately was probably good for him. Gradually, he came under the influence of a Franciscan monk and learned a great deal from this monk. And you may make a note. I want you to look at that friendship that's discussed. It's on the bottom of page 61. And goes to the top of page 62. All right, during this time he studied a lot and spent a lot of time in self-imposed exile. He decided in 1618 to end his self-imposed isolation and see whether the real world could offer more satisfying knowledge than an academic ivory tower. He would become a soldier. Interesting choice, right? Maybe didn't see that coming from someone who did their best thinking in bed. You probably have to stand up for most of your soldiering. Well, again, he thought this was going to fulfill him, and it did not. He spent time as a soldier, but it states, found nothing that would satisfy me. Luckily, during this time, he met a renowned mathematician, and they talked, and it was a lot of these, like I said, are chance meetings. So he happened to meet this person and then was influenced by him, and Beekman played a big role in the development of some of Descartes' theories. All right. Okay, make a note to read carefully page 62, paragraph 3. Well, actually, you know what? We'll take time to read it now. It starts with the first occurred. Does someone want to read for us? Yeah, if you could read nice and loud. Thanks.
The first occurred while he was meditating in bed at his inn one morning and noticed a fly buzzing in the corner of his room. In a flash of inspiration, he realized that the fly's position at any instant could be precisely defined by 3 numbers, representing the fly's perpendicular distances from the 2 walls and the ceiling. Generalizing from this, he recognized that any point in space could similarly be defined by its numerical distances from arbitrary defined lines or planes, and further that the shape of a moving point's course could be defined by a sequence of such numbers. Here was a potential method for integrating geometry, the study of shapes, with algebra, numerical calculations, the founding idea for a new discipline of analytic geometry, which has since become a standard part of the mathematical curriculum and Descartes' honor, the distances of a point from the perpendicular x and y axis, the
You got it, abscissa?
abscissa and ordinate of the standard graph are known as the Cartesian coordinates.
All right. So the idea of analytic geometry, we credit him with that idea. The melding of numbers, algebra with geometry, the study of shapes was groundbreaking. All right, very, very groundbreaking. And when you read about Descartes, that information in that paragraph is mentioned frequently because it was one of those light bulb moments. And he was someone who would have light bulb moments where sort of, I don't know if you've ever been like that, you're trying to understand something and then all of a sudden there's a flash of inspiration and you understand it.
Okay, so analytic geometry, like I said, it was pioneered by Descartes. It holds that any point in space can be defined by its numerical distance from arbitrarily defined lines or planes, and that a moving point's course can be defined by a sequence of such numbers. Okay, Descartes' first rule for acquiring knowledge. When you think about Descartes, think about doubting, and not like just doubting some things, but doubting everything. Descartes' first rule for acquiring knowledge was never to accept anything as true unless it presented itself so clearly and distinctly in my mind that there was no reason or occasion to doubt. What Descartes did was develop a systematic and deliberate approach to doubting everything until hitting upon a bedrock of absolutely unchallengeable ideas. Now, when you hear that, are you reminded of a philosopher we've already spoken of, perhaps?
My only wisdom is knowing that I don't know anything.
Socrates, right? So Socrates had this idea of we need to question someone, right? And you come to understanding what is true by finding out what is untrue. So when I read that, I thought there's a similarity we can draw between those two individuals. As an aside, that may be an essay question that you have. So take a little bit of time and think about how you might compare those two philosophers in reference to this.
Okay, Descartes wrote about this idea and he was able to, again, when you have
Independent wealth, you don't necessarily have to have a job that brings home the bacon, as it were, right? You don't have to be a stonecutter. He spent about 9 years writing about his idea of simple natures. So according to Descartes, the only two properties of physical phenomena that could not be further analyzed or doubted was extension, the space occupied by a body, and motion. All right, on page 64 at the top, I'm going to read from that first paragraph. So first of all, he doubted all of his sensory experiences. I may think I'm seeing reality, but perhaps I'm not. I may think I'm smelling something, a rose, but maybe it's not. So after systematically doubting all of his sensory experiences, which is the empirical method, Descartes concluded that just two physical properties qualified as simple natures. Extension, like I said, the space occupied by a physical party or body. particle or body, and motion, the movement of an extended particle or body throughout space. All physical phenomena, he believed, could be explained in terms of just these two properties. Light, heat, sound, and all other sensory impressions presumably resulted from the motions and interactions of extremely small but still extended material bodies or particles. And this idea links to some ideas that Galileo was coming up with around this same time period. Okay. Galileo was an Italian scientist who created a theory of primary and secondary qualities that were similar to Descartes' theory of simple natures and around at the same time. His take was a little bit different, though. According to Galileo, the three primary qualities that resided inherently in matter were the following: shape. Everything has a shape. It's of a specified quantity, and it has a motion. And he said everything in the universe arises from these qualities. And he focused on elements such as fire, water, to help explain this. Okay, secondary qualities do not reside in matter, but rather arise only after we experience these qualities. All right, so primary qualities, the object itself. Secondary qualities, how we experience that object. Does that sort of make sense? All right, so the sight, sound, smells, and feelings are the secondary qualities. Okay. These were ideas that Descartes toiled away at for about 9 years, remember? He was writing a book. He didn't seek to publish his ideas until there was a lecture and someone was talking about the concept of simple natures, and Descartes felt he really didn't appreciate exactly what that was. So Descartes, wanting to set this man straight, decided he was going to publish his book. His book synthesized medicine and mechanics, separated it into physics and physiology. However, on the way to getting the book printed, he found out that Galileo had been condemned by the Catholic Church. And that would happen a lot, right? There was still this belief, science was tinged with theology, this idea of gods, as we talked about with Hippocrates. A lot of people thought that gods were responsible for someone becoming sick, right? Or maybe someone becoming well. And there's nothing you can do about that. So Galileo was condemned by the Catholic Church for supporting that theory that the earth revolves around the sun. And that was a crime according to them. They were going to say, no, the sun actually revolves around the earth. He withdrew the book from publication, and it was published after his death. All right. Le monde means the world, and in this he talks about the fact that the entire universe is filled with 3 different kinds of material particles. Fire or heat is very tiny. They constitute a virtually perfect fluid capable of filling up space of any shape or size. Then we have air. So fire are going to be small particles that we can't see. Air is going to be larger than fire particles, but still too small for us to perceive individually. So we can't perceive with our eyes these individually. More numerous than other particles, they completely fill the space between objects. And then Earth was known as the heaviest of Descartes' 3 particles. So all solid material objects were made of Earth. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and move into watching this short video about Descartes, just to take a little bit of a break from all this information I'm throwing at you, because I know it's a lot. We'll go back on Thursday and talk in more detail about these concepts, because they're pretty important, but they are difficult concepts, and I understand that.
Do you want us to take note?
Yes, remember, anything that's in the PowerPoints, anything that I post is fair game for test material. Yeah, thanks for asking.
We need a symbol.
The big game is coming! And there's no good time to use the bathroom. So we're giving you a potty-tunity! Turning our commercial into a bathroom break. So you don't have to choose between missing the ad.
Haha.
Athens, 2,400 years ago. It's a compact place. Only about 250,000 people live here. There are fine baths, theatres, temples, shopping arcades and gymnasiums. It's warm for more than half the year. This is also home to the world's first true and probably greatest philosopher, Plato. Born into a prominent and wealthy family in the city, Plato devoted his life to one goal: helping people to reach a...
Not that Plato's not important, but let me make sure. Let's talk about Descartes instead. All right, there we
René
go.
Descartes was a French 17th century philosopher, famous above all for saying, "I think, therefore I am," but worthy of our attention for many reasons beyond this. What makes him stand out is that he was a fierce rationalist. In an age when many philosophers still backed up their arguments with appeals to God, Descartes trusted in nothing more than the human power of logic. This is how he defiantly kicked off his book, Rules for the Direction of the Mind. "I shall bring to light the true riches of our souls, opening up to each of us the means whereby we can find, within ourselves, without any help from anyone else, all the knowledge that we may need for the conduct of life." Descartes had immense faith in what introspection, guided by definition, sound argument, and clarity of thought, could achieve. He believed that much of what was wrong with the world was caused by misusing our minds, by confusion, bad definition, and unconscious illogicality. His life was an attempt to make our minds better equipped for the task of thinking. To solve key questions, Descartes proposed that one always had to divide large problems into small, understandable sections by way of incisive questions. This is what he called his method of doubts. We get muddled by certain questions like, what's the meaning of life, or what is love, because we're not careful enough about how we break these big inquiries down. He described the method of doubts as akin to having a large barrel of apples, where good ones mixed with bad ones. To be a philosopher means a commitment to sorting out the entire barrel, to inspecting each apple individually and throwing away all the bad ones to ensure only those of the best quality are left. Another way to think about Descartes, and this explains why he would, among other things, turn out to be such a hero to the leaders of the French Revolution, is that he believed in grounding all of our ideas in individual experience and reason, rather than authority and tradition. In his greatest book, Discourse on the Method, published in 1637, he explained how he had come to write it. "A long time ago, I entirely abandoned the study of letters. Resolving to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found in myself, or else in the great book of the world, I spent my youth travelling, visiting courts and armies, mixing with people of diverse temperaments and ranks, gathering various experiences, testing myself in situations which fortune afforded me, and at all times reflecting personally upon whatever came my way so as to derive some profit from it." Descartes spent a large part of his adult life away from his native France in the Dutch Republic, since he held the belief, not entirely unwisely, that the mercantile Dutch would, as a people, be far too concerned with earning money to pester a free-thinking man like himself. However, it turned out that the Dutch were a little less materialistic than he'd hoped, and the philosopher ended up moving 24 times to keep ahead of spies and government agents. Descartes' subjective approach to philosophy reached its climax when he arrived at the famous phrase, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. The phrase first appeared in French, "Je pense, donc je suis," in the Discourse on the Method, before then appearing in Latin in The Principles of Philosophy of 1644. It was intended to be Descartes' ultimate answer to a question that philosophers sometimes get perhaps unreasonably interested in, namely, How can one know that anything, including oneself, actually exists rather than being some sort of dream or phantasm? On his quest for certainty around this question of whether it might all be a dream, Descartes began by observing that our human senses are deeply unreliable. He couldn't, for example, he said, be trusted to know whether he was actually sitting in a room in his dressing gown next to a fire or merely dreaming of such a thing. But there was one thing he could know for sure. He could trust that he was actually thinking. His existence could be proved by a neat tautological trick. He could not be thinking and wondering if he existed if he did not exist. Therefore, his thinking was a very basic proof of his being, or, to return to the maxim, I think, therefore I am. This might not sound like a huge insight, but Descartes used it as an Archimedean point in an epistemologically unsteady world. With this certainty safely banked, Descartes argued that his mind could go on to discover other, similarly irrefutable truths. Some of the charm of Descartes' work comes from his entwining of personal details along with more arid philosophical passages. He tells us, for example, that his revolutionary idea came to him during the winter of 1619, when he'd escaped the fierce cold of the Low Countries by hopping into a stove and spending the whole day meditating inside. Descartes epitomizes the solitary end of philosophy. One can, in his eyes, solve the most profound problems by searching deep within oneself. Teams of individuals or ideas passed through generations, as they are in universities, are deeply suspect for Descartes. Philosophers don't need gangs of scientists using expensive equipment, unheard of terminology, and huge data sets. They just need a quiet room and a rational mind. At another point, Descartes recounts that he mocked friends of his who once showed up at his home at 11 in the morning and were surprised to find him still in bed. "What are you doing?" they inquired skeptically. "Thinking," Descartes replied. The group was stunned, but Descartes criticized them in turn for privileging often nonsensical practical tasks over the beauty of pure, quiet reflection in bed. In 1649, Descartes finished another great work, Passions of the Soul. It was the outcome of 6 years of correspondence with a royal acquaintance, the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was a keen amateur philosopher and a rather emotional and turbulent soul. She had written to Descartes begging him to write about passions, in order that she might get to know and control her own more clearly. Descartes obliged, thinking that the ancient philosophers had done a poor job of analysing the passions, and that ordinary and not so ordinary people would benefit immensely from another look at the topic. He therefore opened the Passions of the Soul with a characteristic claim: I shall be obliged to write just as if I were considering a topic that no one had dealt with before me. The work provides a beautiful taxonomy of pretty much any passion one might feel, as well as descriptions of their causes, effects, and functions. This is followed by another section called The Discipline of Virtue, a manual of advice on how we can control our passions and enjoy a virtuous life. Descartes identified 6 fundamental passions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. From these, there followed in his eyes an unlimited number of specific passions, combinations of the original ones. Descartes didn't believe in vanquishing passions, as the ancient Stoic philosophers had proposed, merely in learning how to identify them in oneself and understand their impact on one's behavior. He would have been very sympathetic to psychotherapy. He believed that a key task of being a philosopher was to help people understand and therefore control their passions, that is, become a little less anxious, status-driven, scared, or inclined to fall head over heels in love with inappropriate people. He was optimistic about how much progress we could make psychologically. Even those who have the weakest souls can acquire absolute mastery over their passions if they work hard enough at training and guiding them. Descartes' psychological and philosophical work attracted ever more powerful admirers. In 1646, Queen Christina of Sweden got interested in sorting out issues in her mind and began a correspondence with Descartes. She even persuaded the philosopher to move to Sweden to tutor her in passion and philosophy in 1649. However, the early working hours required, the Queen could only make time for lessons at 5 a.m., and the harsh cold soon made Descartes ill. He died of pneumonia in 1650 at the age of 53. To remember Descartes by "I think, therefore I am" is perhaps not as shallow as one might initially have presumed. The sentence does truly capture something important about him and the task of philosophy in general. It signals a commitment to working through emotional confusion, prejudice, and unhelpful tradition in order to arrive at an independent, rationally founded vision of existence.
Okay. I hope that that video helped a little bit in terms of unpacking some of the ideas that were mentioned briefly. What I'd like to do now is have you get into groups, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that I wrote on the board. I want you to discuss those items as a group and then report
At
back.
Cox Mobile, we know you need reliable cell service that goes wherever you do. That's why.
All right. Let's get rid of that. Little sheep, huh? Okay. Let's have, Kobe, let's have the four of you work together.
So probably want to move here and or here. And let's do 3 here. 3 here. 3 here. All right. I'd like for someone to keep track of your notes, and so you may have a scribe and then someone else who will boldly talk on behalf of the group. All right. First thing I want you to discuss is the apple analogy. He talked about the method of doubting everything, and there was an apple analogy that was mentioned, so I want you to talk about that. He talked about grounding ideas in individual experience and reasoning. Expand on that. I want you to discuss what you think he felt about the empirical method as a way of knowing about the world. And then finally, toward the end of the video, they mentioned the idea of passions, which now
Would be more akin to feelings and emotions, right? I want you to talk about passions. Several examples were provided, and then it was stated that we have our overall passions, and then we have smaller passions. So what are those smaller passions formed out of? Okay, take about 5 minutes, and then we will reconvene as a class.
Like he was one big problem.
He said like dividing our problems into smaller, but smaller
more so into like the facts, like what was real was
just be like breaking everything down.
for sure know about things in person. So that would have been some.
Yeah, because he wants to be certain. One that like was just like
And the passions, I tried to write these
also
down, but
like go to the World Series.
I know, I got hatred.
First game first.
Sadness. I can't remember what the other ones were.
I just got on that the overall idea, which was identify and understand. So I guess you could just say emotions.
Ideas, wonder, intrigues, passion, and desire.
I know there's like the 5 core.
It's like the old, I need to put the
Wonder, first of all, passions, love, hatred, desire, and joy.
sadness, rather than just like what you are told.
Those are like the main passions, and then like things can stem off from them, like you know, narrow down, like is it the kind of love where there's different forms of love, there's different forms of joy, and so it's depending on like situational and everything. So,
Okay, so on that other thing, it says, what did he think of empiricism? I guess he was an empiricist.
So what do you think of empiricism?
I think our report says how he feels about it.
That or he wanted to be like a step above it.
This whole thing where it was like it felt like everyone did the most like thinking and deepest like understanding of things and they were better and then like so it was quiet and people was like their space.
Yeah. Inductive? Deductive? I just know that he makes me think of Sherlock.
Just the quiet moments and sit things and so on.
Yeah, he does. People that
Like nowadays, people questions or stuff, they just need pure quiet reflection.
They need to like look inside.
Yes, that's true.
I thought it was funny that he meditated in the stove.
I know, I was like,
He had a moment.
says she is. And then it's like he had an existential crisis, but he solved it. Begging him to write about his passions in order that she
His method of doubt is where he saw like larger problems and then the way to solve them was to make them into smaller things and to solve each of those. 24 times in order to avoid government agents and spies. People think therefore I am, whereas he knows he's alive. He's able to think in that way. So it's like I understand it's hard to like word, but like I understand what it means.
So one of the things he was whether or not she sits on the bench, warming herself on fire, or sleeping and dreaming. The only thing is, this one's
It's hard because like I want to write down those in the video, but if I'm writing down, I'm not listening to the video, and then if I'm listening to the video, like I'm gonna have to go back and watch that 3 more times just to make sure I remember. It did go way too fast.
Yeah. And then just skipped over and was like, okay.
That's where I like to be able to pause the video and watch it myself.
Take about 2 more minutes and then we'll discuss, okay?
Give me the life. If she doesn't have this posted, I'll definitely shoot her an email after she posted.
I'm trying to find out what's in there. I was
Don't worry,
like,
it was like just.
locked in on this.
The question is, let's see, this one was composed. Most of ones are mixtures of. He's saying as he is, it is like every other emotional experience is a combination of something that are unreliable, the rest.
I was actually reading this chapter and so I was down in the lounge and they can't think of her name. Blonde girl, I guess she works in the office down here. Anyway, she grabbed me. They didn't have anyone show up for that women computing event.
Oh, I saw it.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and chat for a bit. Who would like to go first and talk about one of these items? We can start with an apple analogy. What's the idea there?
Sure.
Yes, I really appreciate that. I always appreciate it.
what we kind of discussed and what I kind of overheard everybody else is breaking down larger problems into smaller achievable stuff and seeing through what's real versus like what's not, like deciding what we can actually do and accomplish.
And so when we're talking about the apples, there was a picture, and what was the person doing with the apples?
Sorting through the rotten net?
Yeah, sorting through the rotten apples. So figuring out from all the knowledge we have or all the information we have, how do we determine, and you talked about the steps that we use, but how do we determine what is knowledge that is meaningful and is true versus something that's akin to junk in his mind? Okay, good start. Second item I wanted you to talk about is the concept of grounding ideas in individual experience and reasoning. This is a little bit different than accepting as truth everything that's written in books, right? We're going to accept this from some authority and it's true because they say it's true. So this is a little bit different. Talk to me about that.
I think his idea of establishing as a like unpersonal truth was to think about something, to mull it over, to think about it from all the different ways he could think about it until he could say, like, without question, like, there's no doubt in my mind, like, this is true.
Good. So, not a task for the easily weary people, right? And probably not a task that you would have time to do if you were a stonecutter. So again, you need to think about these ideas, and they were truly remarkable, but then think about the people who would actually have time to really think those deep thoughts for many hours a day to arrive at those truths. Good. What does Descartes think about the empirical method of knowing the world?
He disagrees with it because he wants to be certain.
Right.
He has doubts. That's like what he's about.
He is all about doubts. Okay. So what we see, what we feel, what we hear may not be true. On some level, the moment we hear something, we're interpreting it also, right? So that our senses could be faulty, and so we are to doubt those as well. And finally, talk a little bit to me, this group, about the passions and then more specific passions. So what was meant by the term passions during Descartes' time?
He kind of believed that all emotions were a combination of love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness.
So, for instance, love and hatred would be a primary passion, right? And we can think of primary emotions. When you're born, you have the ability to express sadness, right? You have the ability to, and these are universal emotions, to express disgust. Let's take those two. So sadness and disgust, and you're talking about love and hatred. Those are basic emotions, but from that, when we talk about emotions, we have many nuanced words that we use. So there can be combinations of different basic emotions that form that more nuanced language, okay? Like thinking about if someone is nonchalant, what does that mean? They're kind of bored, they don't really care about something. And so that's a combination of some different emotions coming into play. Good. Anything else from this video that you would like to talk about or have questions about? We want to move on? All right. We are not quite ready to leave Descartes, but we will be in a moment. In addition to all the doubting he did, doubting ideas, doubting what we could see with our senses, he also was interested in mechanistic physiology. Okay? And on page 66, it talks about the fact that Galileo had analyzed the body's bones and joints and looked at them as a system of physical levers. British physician Harvey had described the heart as a physical pumping mechanism with blood constantly circulating throughout the body. All right, in terms of what Descartes contributed to and looked at in reference to mechanistic physiology, he analyzed the digestion of food, the circulation of blood, our breathing and respiration, and declared that these movements occur mechanically. So these are occurring automatically. And he compared these movements to no more or no less than the movements of an inanimate object like a clock. All right, so something works like clockwork. He also laid the groundwork for this idea of neurons and nerve signals. So he recognized that there was this clear yellowish liquid that resides in the brain's ventricles. He talked a lot about different ventricles, and he was onto something. These were not animal spirits, as we find out later, but rather cerebrospinal fluid. But the idea is there, right? It's not the word we have today. It breaks with the concept of there being spirits controlling us, but it's still there. He also, although he didn't come up with the word reflex, he noticed through his work that a reflex was a sequence in which a specific stimulus from the external world automatically elicits a specific response. We are born with certain reflexes. Some of those reflexes go away pretty quickly, like the Babinski reflex, but blinking stays with us, right? So we blink just naturally to keep our eyes moist, but we may also blink when what happens? Yeah, you get dirt in your eye. What did you say?
When something comes at you.
When something comes at you, yeah, you may blink. What else? I have a horrible time keeping my eye open at the eye doctor's office when they do that puff of air in the eye, and they say, keep your eye open, but my reflex is to close it, right? Because that's what our eyes naturally do. If you've gone into the doctor and they have that old school tool and they tap your knee you should do something. You should respond somehow, right? Other examples of reflexes. Or stimulus and response. Swallowing, okay.
Depending on the age, when they do stuff with babies, at certain ages, they can put a baby in water and it can still swim. But then that changes.
Yeah. So like I said, there are some reflexes that stay with us throughout the course of our life, and there are some that specifically babies have that on some level keep them kind of safe, that when they do the APGAR test, which they do to make sure the baby is nice and healthy, they want to test those reflexes. We will talk more about mechanistic physiology next time. As is true with his method of doubt, there's a lot to discuss, and I want to break that down and maybe try to find some images to show you a little bit about how Descartes' ideas are connected to the idea of neurons, rather than just saying that to you, but without providing a lot of information to tie those two things together. Okay? All right. We will end class today by watching this short video on the next person who will be in the spotlight. We're going to be talking about John Locke and Berkeley next class period after we finish talking about Descartes. Please take some notes. We will start class with a discussion of the video, followed by our usual PowerPoint. All right?
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
By the time we're done today, I just might have you questioning whether this apple is real or not. Think I can't do it? Give me about 10 minutes, I might have you wondering whether I'm a physical object or not. And the same goes for all this stuff. And for your computer, and Nick behind the camera, and you. How? By unleashing the power of empiricism. Last time, we learned about 17th century philosopher René Descartes and how he upended the apple basket that was his entire personal belief system and descended into a radical skepticism, only to emerge with his conviction that cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This one idea, the fact that he was thinking, or really the fact that he was doubting, allowed him to build back up one by one more beliefs that he thought he could rely on. But in the end, most of the beliefs that Descartes ended up putting back into his intellectual apple basket had to do with the immaterial world. Like, he decided that he could believe that he existed as a thinking thing, and he believed that God existed. Ultimately, he lit upon the idea that some of our thoughts are clear and distinct in a way that somehow guarantees their truth. But a lot of philosophers disagreed. They argued that thinking on its own wasn't enough. Like, just because you're thinking doesn't mean that your thoughts correspond to material reality in any reliable way. Basically, Descartes' philosophical opponents thought that the cogito was a dead end. So here we start to see a split between two different understandings of how we can most reliably get to the nature of reality, and therefore truth. Both were responses to the constant questioning that is skepticism. On the one hand, there was rationalism, and on the other, empiricism. Descartes, like Plato before him, was a lover of reason. He met skepticism with rationalism. He believed that the most real things in life were ideas, propositions that can be known through pure reason. Deductive truths, which we talked about before, fall into this category, and mathematical truths do too. But by contrast, empiricism is based on the principle that the most reliable source of knowledge isn't our ideas or our reasoning, but our senses. Sure, we can know things through deduction and basic logic, but what actually leads us to truth, or at least gives us our best shot at getting there, are things like induction and the scientific method, ways of thinking that tell us about the material world. Probably the most famous split among philosophers between these two camps was the lifelong debate between Plato and Aristotle. Plato was convinced that truth resided in the immaterial world of ideas, while Aristotle's attention was focused firmly on the ground. But what about in Descartes' day? If he was the original prototype of the navel-gazing philosopher, a living example of rationalist thinking, then his foil was the 17th century English thinker John Locke. This is where he was born. Locke believed that we are all born as tabula rasa, or a blank slate. He argued that all knowledge is obtained through experience. He rejected the concept of innate ideas, the view that we're born preloaded with certain information like what's good versus what's bad, or what is the nature of God. Locke thought that we are born knowing nothing, and instead all of our knowledge comes to us through sense data. But one place where Locke agreed with Descartes was in the idea that just because your senses tell you something, that doesn't mean you can trust it. After all, sometimes your senses give you false information, like when you think you see or hear something that's just not there. Descartes' response to this, of course, was to just throw out all sense experience as an unreliable source of knowledge. But Locke didn't go that far. Instead, in order to figure out whether the senses accurately reflect the outside world, he introduced a distinction between what he called the primary and secondary qualities of all things. Primary qualities are qualities that physical objects themselves have. They're not in our minds, Locke argued. They're actually in the stuff. These primary qualities include things like solidity, the density, weight, and mass of an object, and also extension, the height, depth, and width that a certain thing has. He also included figure, or the shape of an object, as well as mobility, which is this, whether it's stationary or in motion. So primary qualities, Locke said, belong to the thing itself. Take this apple. It weighs maybe 150 grams, it's the size of my palm, roundish but firm with the slightest bit of give, and right now it's moving through the air. Those are its primary qualities. But it has secondary qualities too, and by Locke's standards they are not real, at least not in any objective, agreed upon way. They're just in our minds, but they get there through the primary qualities. I'm talking about things like its color, taste, texture, smell, and sound. The secondary qualities of this apple are its redness, how it tastes and smells and feels on my tongue and hand, even how it sounds when I bite into it. Locke believed that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities explained the disagreements that we all have about our perceptions of the outside world. Like, we could measure this apple in a bunch of different ways and all agree on its primary qualities, but its secondary qualities would no doubt lead to some disputes. Like, is it really red? What kind of red exactly? Cardinal red or carmine red? It's kind of dark purple at the top, or is it just like a dark pink? What about the sound it made? Would I call that crunchy or crispy? Or I don't like that bitey? It's like apple sound. We could argue about that kind of stuff till the cows came home. But if we disagree about its primary qualities, one of us is simply wrong, because primary qualities have nothing to do with you or me. Instead, they have everything to do with the object itself. Locke's reasoning was simple, even elegant, extracting a lot of explanatory power out of very few basic concepts. As a result, it resonated with a lot of people. And one person it resonated strongly with was the Irish Irish philosopher George Berkeley. He was moved by Locke's empiricism and took it seriously. So seriously, in fact, that he ended up using Locke's own logic against him. He basically took empiricism to its logical conclusion, dismantling the whole process of perception to the point that he had to wonder whether anything existed at all. Berkeley began by taking apart the distinction that Locke made between primary and secondary qualities. Like, think about this apple again. How do you know its shape? Locke said the apple's shape as a primary quality is immediately perceivable. But Berkeley pointed out that you don't perceive some qualities of an object while totally disregarding others. Like, you can't detect an apple's shape without first, or at least also, detecting its color. When you think about it, you can't detect any of the primary qualities without also considering the secondary ones. You can't see a colorless apple. You can't feel a textureless apple. In fact, if you try to strip away the apple's secondary qualities in an effort to get at the primary ones, you end up with no apple at all. Try it. Close your eyes and imagine an apple made of only primary qualities. So it has a certain shape, a certain size, but it doesn't have any color or texture or taste. You can't do it. You try to imagine it with no color, but really you're probably imagining one that's either black or white or transparent, the color of what's behind it. And if you try to imagine it as having no texture, you'll find that there's still texture there. It's just smooth. Remember, Locke asserted that secondary qualities are not objectively real. They can only be subjectively perceived. But now, Berkeley has shown that the two are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other, which means that the primary qualities can't be real either. They too are just what your mind makes of things. So this led Berkeley to a startling conclusion. There's just no such thing as matter. There can't be. Instead, there's only perceptions. Berkeley's famous assertion, his version of cogito ergo sum, was esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. In his opinion, there are no objects, only perceivers. And even then, the perceivers themselves don't really have any physical form. They're just disembodied minds, perceiving things that aren't really there. A little bit terrifying when you start thinking about it. In Berkeley's scenario, we're all set adrift in a world of nothing but thought. What's scary about this is that if everything's just perception, then when the perception goes away, there can't be anything left. So, like, please, for the love of Pete, do not turn away from your computer. If you stop perceiving me, I stop existing. But what if maybe you don't care about me? Still, you'd better not go to sleep, because as soon as you do, you'll cease to exist, because you won't be able to perceive yourself. The only guarantee that you'll continue to exist in your sleep is to have a friend watch you when you're sleeping, which probably is a non-starter for a number of reasons. But in any case, the second your friend blinks, you're gone. So in the end, Berkeley believed that there was only one thing that kept us and everything else from disappearing into oblivion: God. Berkeley believed that God was the ultimate perceiver. God is always watching with unblinking perception that holds objects in existence even when we're not paying attention. The tough thing about Berkeley is, we all pretty much think he has to be wrong. Very few of us are willing to give up our belief in the physical world, no matter who's watching. We are sensory animals. We really need this apple to exist. Next time, we're gonna take a side journey into the world of knowledge, and then in episode 8, we'll see if Karl Popper can manage to get the physical world back for us. Today, we have learned about empiricism as a response to skepticism. We talked about John Locke and his distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and we've seen why George Berkeley thinks that distinction ultimately falls apart, leaving us with literally nothing but our minds, ideas, and perceptions. This episode of Crash Course Philosophy is made possible by Squarespace. Squarespace is a way to create a website, blog.
Thursday. Everyone, I want you to spend some time on our chapter on Descartes. Even if you've read that chapter, I would like for you to reread. There were a couple of places where I suggested page numbers, and that's information that might be on the exam or might be more of the focus of the exam. So I just want you to really be prepared. Also, come with your questions. I know that writing is a lot to unpack. If you turned in a hard copy of your assignment, I have that for you. Otherwise, I will be posting a grade for you on Blackboard. Remember that you can redo the assignment. If you're not happy with your grade, you're welcome to do that. And if you would like some feedback before you do the redo, I'm happy to give that to you. Okay? Have a great day, and I will see you very soon.
Did you want a hard copy of?
Sure, I'll take it.